Hello and welcome to the AURP 2020 International Conference. I am Dan Duncan, President of the AURP Board of Directors and moderator for this session. This is a live stream session and we ask that as you have questions, please put them in the chat feature and we will get to the chat at the end of the session. To open our conference, we are thrilled that Steve Case, one of America's best known and most accomplished entrepreneurs, is joining us. Steve, welcome to AURP's first virtual international conference.
Well, great to be with you all.
Great. Steve, thank you for being here. We first met back in October of 2016, seems like quite a while ago, when the Rise of the Rest Tour visited Nebraska Innovation Campus. Not all of our audience may be familiar with Revolution and the Rise of the Rest Tour. Could you give them an overview of what your current focus is with these entities right now?
Sure. Well, I launched Revolution about 15 years ago after I stepped down as CEO of AOL when we merged AOL and Time Warner, and decided rather than start another company to back entrepreneurs building interesting companies doing important things in terms of improving important aspects of our everyday lives. So that really was the backstory. We initially launched with a growth fund, then we launched a venture fund, and then more recently launched a seed fund. But all the while we've had a bias, which is since so much venture capital focuses on places like Silicon Valley, we try to focus on other places such as Nebraska, Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Virginia, really the rest of the country. And as you probably know, the data here is pretty amazing. That last year, if you look at venture capital dollars, 75% went to just 3 states: California, New York, and Massachusetts. So the other 47 states kind of fight over 25%. And we recognize, and obviously the work of the association recognizes, that there are great innovations happening everywhere. There's great entrepreneurs everywhere, but capital is not distributed everywhere. And that's what we're trying to change with Rise of the Rest. So it's initially started as bus tours. We've now done 8 road trips, including when we met in Nebraska. So far, we've visited 44 cities over the last 5 years or so, really trying to understand what's happening in each city, figure out ways we can drive more connectivity, more collaboration in each city, try to shine a spotlight on what the entrepreneurs are doing to attract more capital, both locally and nationally to each city. And in the last 3 years or so, it's really ramped up where we created a seed fund with some of the most prominent entrepreneurs and investors in the country: Jeff Bezos of Amazon, Howard Schultz of Starbucks, people like that, who are all investors in this Rise of the Rest Fund, sharing our belief that innovation can in fact happen everywhere, and the next generation of great disruptive companies won't just be coming in places like Silicon Valley, but many parts of the country.
Well, great. You also have Revolution, and I think you have a venture fund and a growth fund. Would
Right.
you talk a little bit about those? Because Rise of the Rest is really a seed fund, correct?
Yeah, no, the way we've tried to build Revolution is to be able to support entrepreneurs at kind of every stage of the entrepreneurial journey. At the very early seed stage, when it really is closer to being just an idea, to the venture stage where you've got some kind of sense of what you're doing. Usually you have some product market fit, have a team, have some revenues, but you need the initial capital to get going. And then the later stage growth, when you really do know what the opportunity is, and you're trying to raise the capital to really expand your team, accelerate your marketing, whatever it might be. It obviously depends on the sector. So that's why we have seed, venture, and growth. And on the later stage, we back some amazing companies. Clear, which some of you may know from the airport security business, but then more recently focused on Health Pass, which is in the COVID world, working with the sports leagues on that. We've backed companies like Talkspace, which is focused on digital mental health. Tempest doing some really interesting things with big data around oncology. Some amazing entrepreneurs that are doing amazing things, and as I said, not just in Silicon Valley, but all over the country.
And the fund's really focused on tech-based, tech-enabled technologies. Anything else you've dabbled in, bio companies or anything like that, Steve? Yeah,
it's fairly broad, particularly on the seed fund, because it is place-based. Where our strategy there is we'll invest in partnership with regional investors. We don't lead the rounds on the seed deals. We partner with mostly folks that live near where the companies are. And so we're sector agnostic. That's a place-based strategy, not a sector-based strategy. So it really runs the whole gamut. We're seeing great innovations happening kind of all across the economy. And we do believe it ties in with we believe in this rise of the rest. We believe these cities are rising, and many people on this call are kind of on the front lines of that, trying to drive the innovation out of the universities into the hands of entrepreneurs, figure out how to attract the team, attract the capital to scale the businesses. So that idea of the rise of the rest and rising cities kind of underpins our strategy. The other thing that really underpins our strategy is what I've kind of termed the third wave of the internet. I was obviously, when I was a co-founder of AOL, which was 35 years ago this summer, and believe it or not, when we started, only 3% of people were online, and those 3% were online an average of 1 hour a week. So it's kind of early days. Who would have thought that we'd be in the Zoom world now, where essentially we're living our lives and conducting our businesses almost exclusively online. That first wave was really building the on-ramps, building the servers, creating the content and services that made it interesting for people to get on. That was really the 80s and the 90s were kind of defining that first wave. The second wave has been the last 20 years, was really building apps, services, software on top of the internet. Facebook, Google are some of the obvious companies there. And a lot of that did center in Silicon Valley. We think the third wave, when kind of the internet meets the real world and it starts impacting things like healthcare and food and agriculture, things like that, that's where the expertise, agriculture, for example, places like Nebraska, should have an obvious advantage, an obvious lead in ag tech, not just people sitting in San Francisco or New York City. But you've got to create the strong startup ecosystems. You've got to be a magnet for talent. You've got to be a magnet for capital, really, to take those ideas and scale. So we think in this third wave of the internet, there'll be opportunities to disrupt some of the most important sectors in our economy, some of the largest sectors in our economy, and it's not going to be running the plays of the past. It's not going to just be investing in the places of the past. We think cities all around the country have a real advantage if they can create those strong, vibrant startup ecosystems.
Great. Startup companies are really a vital part of really any innovation ecosystem. And they're really especially important to AURP members, because many of us focus a great deal of our time on trying to build up startup communities because they're really part of communities of innovation. And you really can't have dynamic innovation without a dynamic startup scene, as you just had mentioned. I was interested in May, you wrote an op-ed for CNBC, and then again in July, one for the Washington Post, discussing policy changes you feel would spur the economy forward during and post-pandemic. Notably, pumping funds into startups, especially ones with female and people of color founders. Can you recap and update, if necessary, your thoughts since you wrote those op-eds?
Well, sure, but the backdrop of it really is recognizing the central role startups play in our communities and our economy. And this was a little bit news to me, frankly, when I got involved about 10 years ago with some policy efforts in the DC area. I was asked to co-chair the National Advisory Council on Innovation and Entrepreneurship, which led to an initiative that was launched at the White House, which I was asked to chair, called Startup America. And I then worked with the White House and Congress in a bipartisan way to pass the Jobs Act about 6-7 years ago, jumpstarting our Business Startups Act. So I kind of ended up learning more and more about what was underlying some of this, and realized then that while small business obviously accounts for a lot of jobs in our communities and is an important kind of foundation of our communities, as a sector, it doesn't actually create jobs. If one restaurant goes out of business, it's going to likely get replaced by another restaurant. They're likely going to hire about the same number of people. And similarly, and sort of surprisingly, at least to me, big business, Fortune 500 as a sector doesn't create much in the way of jobs either. There are some companies growing fast and creating a lot of jobs, Amazon being one of the recent ones, certainly. But there are other big companies like General Electric that have been losing jobs. If you add up all the job creation and job loss in that big company Fortune 500 sector, they don't account for new jobs. The real driver of this in every community, and certainly across our country, are new companies, startups. And so focusing more on that, not just on the needs of small business, not just on the needs of big business, but on the needs of new businesses, and not just tech startups, really kind of across the whole landscape, I think is critically important. So that's the first point. The second point is getting people in different states and cities, including I know many people on this are involved in this, when they are focused on economic development, not just focused on the existing businesses, but also focus on new business, not just focusing on the industries of the past, but also the industries of the future, not just focusing on trying to get a factory or headquarters, but from an existing company, but actually launching new companies that someday will need a big factory or a big headquarters. That mindset, I think, is critically important. And then there are some specific things that can, I think, be done from a policy standpoint, and it's one of the things I hope that whether irrespective of what happens this week with the election, I hope when Congress starts working again in a significant way, probably in January, there will be more focus on some of the needs in the economy right now because of the pandemic, and it will focus in part on new businesses, not just existing businesses. And there are a bunch of specific things I wrote about in that op-ed that are a framework to consider.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. We've had a very interesting 2020 with a lot of different social issues beyond just, the ones that the pandemic has created. And I noticed you have an event happening on December 3rd, a virtual pitch conference that really maybe helps target some of what we've been seeing around the country. You want to talk a little bit about your pitch event?
No, as you say, it's been a terrible year in so many respects for the country. A pandemic, which creates a health crisis and a jobs crisis, and our economies are in many areas in free fall. Our small businesses are struggling. Many have gone out of business, and there's obviously a lot of aspects to that. But sadly, we also have been encountering a crisis in terms of race in many communities around the country. And as we looked at the data there, a lot of our focus with Rise the Rest, as I mentioned, was on place, the 75% of the capital going to 3 states. But if you look at people, it's actually even more sobering that the last year, over 90% of venture capital in this country went to men, less than 10% to women, even though women represent half of our population. And last year, even though Black Americans are about 14% of our population, Black founders, Black entrepreneurs got less than 1% of our venture capital. So if you just look at the data, it's pretty clear that it does matter kind of where you live, and it does matter what you look like. If you have an idea, whether you have a shot at building a company, really a shot at the American dream. And we're trying to kind of change that paradigm, kind of level the playing field. And the initiative you're talking about in the early December, we can't do a bus tour right now because of obviously the COVID situation. So we're doing a virtual bus tour with a particular focus on Black founders. And we're now partnering with more than 100 venture capital organizations all around the country. And together with them in partnership with Morgan Stanley and OHub out of Atlanta and many other partners are going to be doing a national pitch competition focused specifically, as I said, on Black founders. The winner will get a $1 million investment. The 2 runner-ups will each get $500,000 investments. But actually dozens and dozens of the companies that apply, we're going to connect to those other venture capitalists. The 100+ venture capitalists agreed to join us and make sure each of them has an opportunity to meet with venture capitalists. So hopefully many companies beyond the 3 win on that day will get the capital they need, get the connections they need. And what we've heard on both sides of this, that for Black founders, also true for brown founders, female founders, others that historically have not had the same access to capital, those entrepreneurs don't really have the connections, don't really have the networks, often don't really have friends and family that can write some of the initial kind of angel checks. So they need introductions. And on the other side, venture capitalists often don't have the networks either. They typically are focused in a particular area, say Silicon Valley. They typically are investing in people that they knew from the past in terms of companies they worked at or schools they went to or what have you, and don't really have a broader network, don't really therefore have broader deal flow. So what they're saying is, okay, we understand there's a problem here. We want to be part of the solution. We also think it could be a great investment opportunity because some of these entrepreneurs obviously will build some fabulous businesses. Help us as venture capitalists connect to those entrepreneurs. And the entrepreneurs are saying, help us connect to the venture capitalists. So that's what we're trying to do with this a series of events in early December, including the pitch competition on December 3rd.
Well, I think that's great, and I commend you for doing that. I think it's long overdue, and really excited to see what comes out of that. if we focus a little bit more on the pandemic and kind of where we're at, what kind of trends do you see coming out of the pandemic as far as industry changes, talent, those types of things?
Well, it's a great question. I mean, obviously, we're still in the middle of this, so it's a little premature to be precise about what will happen, but we have seen in the last 7 or 8 months some clear trends, some acceleration of some trends. Certainly, we've seen that in the area of e-commerce. Not surprisingly, because people were sheltered at home, we've seen dramatic growth of e-commerce sites. Certainly the big players, Amazon, Walmart, but also tons of other players. Actually, a company we back called Big Commerce has had a terrific year this year, in part because more people are buying things online. Similarly, we've seen a real acceleration in telehealth. It's been around for a while, really bubbling for almost 20 years, but there was some institutional resistance to it in terms of doctors and patients not being that comfortable with it. When they couldn't go to the doctor's office, they said, well, come to think of it, I'll give it a try. And it turned out it works pretty well. And now you're seeing an acceleration in telehealth. There are other sectors as well that we're seeing change because of this pandemic. But the other thing to watch is and you reference it, is what's happening outside of particular technologies, particular sectors more broadly in our society. And there are some interesting things to watch there, including the flow of talent. As most of you know, because of the work you do, because so much venture capital was in places like Silicon Valley, there has been a brain drain. And in many parts of the country, people growing up there or going to university there decided when they graduated they needed to go to the coast because that's kind of where the action was. That where the other people that wanted to be part of the innovation economy were. And that certainly was where the money was in terms of venture capital. In the last 7 or 8 months, many of those people have left Silicon Valley and are sheltering someplace else. And often it's a place where they did grow up or a place they did go to school. And some of the people who are sheltering there, what looked like temporarily, are saying, come to think of it, I think I might stay. And initially, maybe I'll still work for the company or organization that I am affiliated with, because a number of companies like Facebook and others are putting in place rather flexible remote work policies. But others will say, once I see what's happening in Omaha and Lincoln, some of these cities, and we've seen this phenomenon all around the country, will say, I really want to be part of the startup sector in those. I've been gone a little bit. I didn't realize so much was happening here. Now that I was forced to come back, even if it was because of a pandemic and even if it was initially thought to be temporary, I think I want to stay. And so we could see a boomerang of people who had left in the last 10, 20, 30 years returning to some of these rising cities, which can catalyze more activity in terms of not just startups, but the speed ups when the startups move from that early stage to the growth stage, and do need a set of skills that some of the people who might be on the coast could provide. So I think this could be a real moment for rising cities, and really could be a time where once we get through this, obviously very challenging pandemic, perhaps one of the silver linings of it will be a dispersion of talent, a dispersion of capital, dispersion of innovation that will help lift up many of these cities that have been somewhat left behind the last 20, 30 years. And over time, help level that playing field and help create more jobs and hope and opportunity in more parts of the country.
Well, I think that's it's going to be a very interesting time moving forward. Do you have any advice you could give to the people at this conference? We're basically leaders of innovation communities, and based on these trends, what do you think we're going to need to do to really adapt and change because of these changing trends?
Well, part of the reason I wanted to do this is I'm grateful for the work everybody's already doing and has, in some cases, been doing for years, in some cases even decades, to try to create stronger kind of entrepreneurial ecosystems in different parts of the country. So first of all, thank you for doing it. I think as we move into this next phase, just recognizing it is a moment and trying to figure out what your strategy should be over the next 6 months, 12 months, to capitalize on this. What could be done to be more of a magnet for talent? There's some cities that have launched even homecoming efforts to really kind of highlight some of the things that are happening in their cities in terms of innovation that could accelerate more? How do you kind of curate and showcase some of the most promising startups? So some of those coastal investors who are beginning to, poke around and think about investing in other places, really, got to do that. And then locally, I think the main thing, and again, most people here know this in some ways, I know I'm kind of preaching to the converted here, but collaboration is really critical. It really, every city we visited, we've been struck by, on the positive side, the sense of momentum building around startups. On the negative side, way too siloed in terms of what's happening, and including universities not necessarily connecting. I'm sure everybody on this call, that's not the case, but in many cases we've seen around the country not connecting as much to the startup community or the larger companies, or the larger companies not really paying attention to what the small companies are doing, or the mayors or the governor not really focusing on the new companies, but rather focusing on the existing companies. So just saying this is a moment and focusing more on what can you do to drive more collaboration, drive more connectivity, get more people understanding what other people are doing and helping each other, and really try to kind of seize the moment, seize the opportunity. So what your efforts are and what's happening in your city can accelerate in the next 5 years because of the situation we're in right now.
Well, great, thanks. I think we're going to have a lot more discussions over the next year among ourselves on that topic. Let's go to the chat questions. We have about 9 minutes left. From Leah Burton at North Carolina State University Centennial Campus. Are you seeing any COVID-19 driven changes yet in investment patterns, like more investment moving to less dense areas, or we're going to have a little lag on that, or what do you think there?
Well, first of all, NC State has been a real leader, I know, and rethinking things like tech transfer, so ideas can get out of the labs and in the hand of entrepreneurs with more agility. So hopefully others are doing that as well, because there is so much intellectual property, so much intellectual horsepower, as you all know, that are in our universities, but often it gets locked up. And obviously what you're doing with Parks is a key part of that. But what are other ways we can kind of get those ideas into the hands of entrepreneurs who can build the teams and raise the capital and take it and run with it? In terms of the flows of capital, we have not seen any data on this, because it does take a little while. The NVCA is a National Venture Capital Association and tracks this thing. So I think it'll take another couple of quarters. My guess is we'll see a little bit of a pickup in the last couple of quarters in terms of more money flowing to these young companies. The real magic, though, as you all know, is when they go from that seed stage to the venture stage to the growth stage, and the checks get bigger. That's when the capital shifts will really accelerate. So we need to start more companies by seeding them. We need to back more of them by providing that initial venture capital, and we need to make sure we're doing a great job of identifying the most promising ones and surround them, whether it be with talent or capital or partnerships or customers or whatever can be done, so those companies will stay where they are and scale where they are and be able to attract the larger checks. And that's when the real dollar flow will happen. So that might take a couple of years before we start seeing that data, but I think we'll see some early data around what's happening with seed round. But I would say it goes back to the reason we launched this diversity focus tour in December. There is some early anecdotal data, including actually TechCrunch wrote an article about this today, that said that some of the people that historically have been left out, including female founders and people of color, are finding it even harder to raise capital because they don't really have the networks. I think one of the things everybody on this call can do is being more intentional, kind of lean into how do we not just support entrepreneurs, but particularly support a more diverse mix of entrepreneurs, so we can create a more inclusive innovation economy, and recognize that it is more difficult for a lot of people to get noticed. A little more difficult to get the meeting. It is more difficult for them to get the capital to take their idea and scale it. So that would be a good area for AURP to focus on.
The next question I think is really interesting. It comes from Laura Frericks at the University of Illinois Research Park, Steve. And she said, do you think virtual meetings with investors, people getting used to having more virtual meetings, will lessen the mindset that investors need to fly to some of the rise of the rest cities? That's always been difficulty, getting the investors there. Do you think they'll be more willing to meet with companies and invest from a virtual platform than they really are pre-COVID.
Yeah, no, I think what happened, not surprisingly, it took us all a little bit of time to adjust to this. And initially, when this first started and people were sheltering, and I thought maybe it'd just be, I don't know, a couple months or so, they said, well, we'll just focus on our existing companies for now, won't really focus on new investments. Then they moved into a phase after that couple months was up, I guess, when they said, okay, well, I guess we have to, start, considering investments, but they focused on the companies they already had met pre-COVID. They already had some relationship with, and used Zoom to supplement it. But in the last 2 or 3 months, it has changed. And I think almost every venture capitalist now recognizes this is sort of, at least for some period of time, and maybe longer than we'd like, sort of the new normal. And they don't want to be out of business in terms of not making new investments. So they are embracing Zoom as a way to reach out to new entrepreneurs. And it is fair to say it should help the rising cities, because if you're happen to be in Silicon Valley as an entrepreneur and happen to be meeting with a Silicon Valley kind of venture capitalist, well, you're on Zoom. What difference does it make if you're a mile away or 1,000 miles away? So you still need to make the connections, which is where I think we all need to focus more and build the bridges between the entrepreneurs and the venture capitalists. But clearly, venture capitalists are finding it is easier than they thought to do virtual meetings, meetings with the management teams and things like that, and are making investment decisions in those. Now, I hope once we get through this phase that they won't just attend the meetings virtually, but they actually will go to these cities, because when they're in these cities, and we've seen this time and time again, if a venture capitalist makes an investment in a city, their first investment in Denver or some Kansas City or some other city that they haven't invested in the past, they're not quite sure what's going on. Once they invest and have a board meetings to attend, and they visit periodically, maybe every quarter or so, they suddenly discover all the other things happening in that city and make other investments in that city. So it's almost like a land and expand strategy, and we're trying to get them to during this COVID period, when we're in this Zoom kind of world, to make more investments in more places, but over time, hopefully recognize that these places really are flourishing, and there are many other opportunities to invest and expand their aperture to make more investments in those cities. That really will help accelerate, obviously, this whole rise of the rest phenomenon.
Great. Well, our next question, I'm going to roll a couple of them together. So Brian Darmody, the CEO of AURP, and Kevin Byrne, the president of the University Financing Foundation, they're asking about opportunity zones. And have you seen opportunity zones really helping with capital in the rise of the rest cities? And how do you see public policy like this moving forward?
I was a supporter of opportunity zones. A number of years ago, was initially introduced as legislation in a bipartisan way in Congress. Like a lot of things, sadly, these days, it then got kind of become more of a partisan kind of issue, got caught up in politics. But any incentives that lead investors who otherwise wouldn't have been paying attention to rising cities to look for opportunities in those places make sense, and particularly investing in these neighborhoods where the poverty levels are quite high and the challenges are quite severe, I think is positive. I think in general, I think it took a little while for the governors to pick where the zone should be, and it took a little while, even longer, for the Treasury Department to put the rules of the road in place. So far, most of the action, most of the investment has been on the real estate side, which is important, particularly in terms of creating infrastructure that supports startups in these rising cities. But my hope is, as things people take a fresh look in the coming months, some of the rules might be tweaked and more capital will actually flow to the companies. There are some folks that are investing in companies in opportunity zones, but right now most of the capital seems to be going into real estate investments in the opportunity zone. So it's, I think, a good idea. It's still in the probably the first innings, maybe the second inning in terms of its evolution. These things always take a little time to kind of get refined and figure out exactly how they're going to work. And the capital markets still are, some capital that's flowed into them, but not as much as I think might be possible over the years ahead. So, good early start, but still a lot of work to do.
Well, Steve, we have about 45 seconds left. And I think probably the last question is really around economic recovery. And being sustainable, and as it relates to research parks, communities of innovation, really contributing to sustaining the economic recovery. Are there any policy things that you think we should talk about?
Yeah, for some of the things we talked about in terms of more focus in terms of startup, particularly in this next stimulus package or relief package, I think that's critical. As you all know, one of the key issues for our country is how do we make sure we have immigration policies allow us to be a magnet for talent, and when what's now a global battle, for talent. I think we've lost some ground in recent years on that front. And how do we make sure that the government, federal government particularly, is funding basic research and the core technologies that are going to drive the future. I think we need to recognize the role that's played in the past, including the creation of the internet. When DARPA was funding that in the early days, we wouldn't all be connected in this way if it hadn't been for that initial government funding. And obviously that goes into research universities that many of the parks are obviously affiliated with. So just recognizing the role of innovation, recognizing the role of startups, recognizing the role of not just people born and raised in this country, but people coming from all around the country. 40% of our Fortune 500 companies were started by immigrants or children of immigrants, and recognizing that we need to double down, particularly now in a world where we're seeing a globalization, innovation, China, other places really stepping up their game, that we as a country need to make sure we're making the right investments in basic research to make sure we win the future.
Well, Steve, thank you so much for keynoting our opening session of the conference. We're out of time, so we need to move on, but we'd love to work with you in the future about a Rise of the Rest tour of research parks. Hopefully we can put that together one of these days. Thank you again for
Thank you, Dan. Thank you all for what you're doing, and we look forward to working together and collaborating.
Awesome. Thanks. And to our audience, thanks for joining us, and enjoy the rest of this dynamic conference.